I was running. My lungs burned with every breath, and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I stumbled over roots and rocks, tripping, barely staying upright. But the footsteps behind me were getting closer, heavy and relentless, pounding through the forest floor, shaking the ground. "Mom! Dad!" I yelled, my voice cracking, but the shadows swallowed it whole. No answer. I was alone out here. They'd left me, abandoned me to the forest and whatever was hunting me. The thing chasing me, I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. It was in every shadow, in every gust of wind, pressing down on me, chilling me to the core. I glanced over my shoulder, and there was nothing there. Nothing I could see, at least. But it was close. I could feel its gaze on the back of my neck, the way it seemed to reach into my mind, its presence like ice spreading through my veins. "Please!" I cried, stumbling and crashing to my knees. My voice was barely a whisper now, strangled by the fear that wrapped around me. It was over. I was going to die here, alone, forgotten. And then I heard it, a voice, quiet but clear. The words twisted and slithered in my mind, each syllable dripping with malice. "Carl." The voice wrapped around my mind, suffocating me. I tried to move, but the darkness pressed in, thick and heavy. I felt something cold on my neck, a breath, freezing and unnatural. I gasped, clawing at the ground, trying to crawl away, but I knew I couldn't escape, not from this. A glint of white flickered in the corner of my eye, a figure so emaciated and twisted it looked like a skeleton stretched thin over a giant human-like frame. It was hairless, its skin stretched tight over its long, bony limbs, its eyes sunken but glowing, fixed on me like a predator about to lunge. Its mouth opened, revealing jagged, sharp fangs, with its lips chewed down to bloody scraps. And then I understood. This thing, this creature was more than a spirit. It was hungry, and it fed on those who were alone, isolated, people like me. "No," I choked out, but my voice barely made a sound. My whole body felt frozen in place, terror locking every muscle. Its mouth opened wider, and I knew it was going to devour me. I screamed, and then I woke up. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. It took a second for me to realize where I was, in my bed, inside the Winnebago. I was safe. The cold, the shadows, that horrible creature with sunken eyes and twisted, chewed lips, gone. I took a shaky breath, wiping the sweat off my forehead. It was just a nightmare, just a dream, but it felt so real. Even now, I could still feel the chill, the weight of those shadows pressing down on me. The quiet hum of the RV filled the air, and the soft snoring of my parents came from the bunk above me. Everything was normal. But as much as I tried to tell myself that, the fear clung to me, lingering at the edges of my mind. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling, and tried to steady my breathing. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. That sunken, hollow face, sharp fangs glinting, the skin stretched thin over its giant, bony frame. I finally drifted back to sleep, but it was restless and full of shadows. The next morning, my mom's voice jolted me awake. "Rise and shine, Carl. Time to hit the road," she called, way too cheerful for this early in the morning. I groaned and rolled over, trying to bury myself under the covers, but she yanked them back. Her smile was annoyingly bright as she tossed a granola bar onto my chest. "Come on, we've got a big day ahead. So many places to see, and fresh air." "Great," I mumbled, forcing myself up, even though all I wanted was to stay in bed. I didn't have the energy to argue, though. Last night's nightmare still clung to me, making everything feel off. This road trip had sounded fine when my parents first mentioned it, but now it felt like one long, boring drive through nowhere. We'd been in the Winnebago for days, bouncing from one national park to the next, driving through endless stretches of wilderness. My parents kept talking about bonding and reconnecting with nature, but I just felt trapped. Stuck in this cramped RV, cut off from the rest of the world, barely any internet, and nothing to do except listen to them talk about scenery. My dad glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his grin wide as he shifted gears. "Ready for another adventure, champ?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure." In reality, I'd rather be anywhere else. The first day, I tried to show a little interest, even listened to a few of their stories about our heritage. But after 3 days of hikes, campfires, and endless family talks, I was over it. And to be honest, I was tired of the way they looked at me, like they wanted me to be someone I wasn't. The drive felt endless. The road narrowed as we drove deeper into the woods, trees lining the path like towering walls, their branches twisting together overhead, blocking out most of the sky. Shadows danced in the dappled sunlight, creating strange, shifting shapes on the ground that I couldn't look away from. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving through the trees, a flicker of something out of place. But whenever I looked, there was nothing there. Just trees. Just shadows. I shook it off, telling myself it was leftover nerves from my nightmare. But I couldn't shake that feeling, the sense of being watched, of something waiting just out of sight. Finally, we pulled into a campsite way out in the middle of nowhere. The forest here was dense, the trees tall and packed close together, their branches stretching high above us. The sun was low, casting a golden glow over everything, and my mom sighed with contentment as she took in the view. "Isn't this peaceful?" she said, beaming at me. I shrugged and turned away, finding my usual corner in the RV while they set up camp. I could hear my mom calling for help, but I ignored her, scrolling through old photos on my phone. No signal, of course, but it was better than sitting around pretending to be excited about trees. As the sun sank lower, shadows crept through the forest, stretching long and dark across the campsite. That chill from my dream returned, the same one I'd felt when I'd woken up, creeping into my bones. After they finished setting up, my parents sat by the campfire, sharing stories from our tribe's past. They always seemed so excited to tell me about the old legends, like they thought I'd suddenly see the magic in it all and start embracing my heritage. I wanted to care, but every story just felt like something from a book, a history I didn't feel a part of. That night, they told me about the Windigo, a spirit that hunted those who were alone. "It looks like a fearsome human-like beast," my mom explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Emaciated and hairless, with giant limbs, glowing sunken eyes, sharp claws and fangs, and lips chewed down to nothing. It preys on lonely, isolated people, feeding on their flesh to sustain its eternal hunger." A chill ran through me, though I forced a laugh, brushing it off as another one of their old ghost stories. But as I glanced out toward the forest, the shadows flickering in the drive took us even deeper into the wilderness, further from any sign of civilization. The road narrowed, winding its way through thick clusters of trees, their branches casting dark shadows over the RV. My dad kept making comments about how great it felt to be out here, away from it all. I just slumped in my seat, staring out the window, feeling like I was the only one who didn't see the appeal. Away from it all felt less like an adventure and more like a slow crawl into nowhere. When we finally reached the next campsite, I was relieved just to get out of the RV. But looking around, I realized this place was somehow even more isolated. Dense forests surrounded us on all sides, the trees stretching up like giants, their limbs twisted and thick. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows that gave the place an eerie, abandoned feel. There wasn't another soul in sight. "We're here," my dad announced, beaming as he parked. My mom climbed out with a smile, stretching and breathing in the crisp air. "Doesn't it feel amazing?" she asked, looking at me expectantly. I just shrugged and turned away, heading back into the RV while they unpacked. I could hear my mom calling me to help with the setup, but I ignored her, pretending not to hear. Instead, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos, even though there was no signal. Looking at familiar faces and places was the only thing keeping me from feeling like I was on another planet. As the last bits of daylight disappeared, a chill settled over the campsite. I could hear the quiet crackling of a fire as my parents settled in, talking softly and sharing stories. I had no intention of joining them. I was just about to climb into bed when a sound broke through the stillness. A rustling in the woods, like something moving through the underbrush. I froze, listening, my heart suddenly thudding in my chest. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the sound was heavy, too loud to be a small animal. It was probably nothing, just the woods. Shaking it off, I crawled into bed, trying to ignore the feeling of unease creeping over me. But just as I was drifting off, I heard it again, a soft, low whisper, almost like someone saying my name. I sat up, heart pounding, but everything was silent. Outside, the trees cast long shadows across the campsite, and I could see my parents still sitting by the fire. Nothing out there. Nothing that should be whispering, anyway. Later, I joined my parents around the campfire, mostly because they'd asked me so many times it was easier to give in. The flames flickered, sending shadows dancing over their faces as they shared stories about our tribe's past. My dad's voice took on that familiar, serious tone he always used when talking about our culture. This time, though, the story was different. He started talking about the Windigo. I'd heard the name before, just in passing, but the way my dad spoke about it now made my stomach twist. His voice was low, almost like he was afraid someone or something might be listening. The Windigo, he said, eyes fixed on the fire. It's a creature that preys on the lonely, a fearsome, emaciated beast, tall as a man but thin as bones, with sunken eyes that glow in the dark and sharp fangs and claws. It has no hair, only tight, sallow skin stretched over its frame. And those lips! He shuddered, as if the memory of it was too much to bear. It chews its own lips down to nothing, just to stop the hunger. But the hunger, it's endless. The Windigo feeds on those who are alone, isolated. It feasts on the flesh of those who have no one to protect them. A shiver ran down my spine, and I tried to laugh it off, but it sounded weak, even to my own ears. So what? It just roams around in the woods looking for loners? My mom's eyes were serious, something I wasn't used to seeing. Carl, these aren't just stories. The Wendigo is a spirit that preys on those who refuse to be part of the community, who isolate themselves from others. It feeds on loneliness and flesh. I forced a laugh, hoping it would break the tension. Sure, whatever. But something about her words stuck with me. The story felt too close, too real, especially after the nightmare last night. And now that chill from my dream seemed to settle around me again, prickling my skin. I looked out into the dark forest, and for a second I thought I saw something move. Just a shadow, a flicker, like something darting between the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. Just the darkness, stretching on endlessly. That night I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. The usual noises were there, the faint rustling of leaves, the soft crackling of the dying fire, my parents breathing in their sleep. But beyond that, there was something else, something deeper. A quiet, almost rhythmic scratching sound, like claws dragging across wood. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the RV settling, maybe an animal scuffling outside. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. I wanted to go check it out, but every instinct told me to stay put, not to look, not to get close to that sound. Then I heard it again, a voice, low, cold, like the whisper from my nightmare. My name, Carl. My stomach twisted, and a chill ran down my spine. I felt frozen, my body refusing to move, even as I told myself to get up, to look out the window, to see what was out there. But I couldn't. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to drown out the sound with my own heartbeat. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shadows and a horrible, emaciated face with glowing, sunken eyes. It was watching me, hungry and patient. The next day, I tried to shake off the night, to brush it off as just a bunch of stories and nerves. But that feeling stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just another story my parents wanted me to believe. But when we packed up to move to the next site, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. And somehow, I knew it was waiting. The road narrowed even further as we drove to the next campsite, winding through the dense, ancient forest. The trees pressed in from all sides, their twisted branches stretching like skeletal arms over the RV, blocking out most of the sunlight. Shadows covered everything, and even though it was midday, the place felt like dusk. I kept staring out the window, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling from last night. But every time I thought about that scratching sound or the faint voice whispering my name, my stomach twisted. "Are you excited for today, Carl?" my mom asked, turning to look at me with that hopeful smile she always had when she wanted me to share in their enthusiasm. "Yeah, sure," I mumbled, my eyes fixed on the forest beyond the glass. I didn't want to let on how on edge I felt, but the woods looked different. Even in the daylight, there was something wrong about them. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, hidden just out of sight. After what felt like hours, we finally pulled into another secluded clearing. It looked almost the same as the last campsite, but more isolated, with thick forest on all sides. The nearest marked trail was nearly a mile away, leaving us in a stretch of trees that felt untouched, wild. "We'll have this place all to ourselves," my dad announced, his voice a little too cheerful. "It's going to be great." My parents set up camp, unpacking everything from the RV and setting up the picnic table, but I hung back. I told them I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't a complete lie. I had barely slept last night, and every time I looked out into the trees, I felt that prickle of unease return. Like we weren't alone. "We're going to take a quick hike to the overlook," my dad said, holding up the map. "It's just a short loop. You sure you don't want to come, Carl?" "Yeah, I'm fine here," I muttered, keeping my eyes on my phone, even though I knew there was no signal. Anything was better than wandering deeper into those woods. "Suit yourself," my mom replied, though I could tell she was a little disappointed. I watched them disappear down the trail, their voices fading into the distance until I was alone. The silence around me felt heavy, thick. I tried to keep busy, flipping through photos and scrolling through my phone, even though it was pointless. After a few minutes, I looked up, glancing at the dense wall of trees surrounding the campsite. They were tall, twisted things, their branches reaching out in tangled knots. The wind had died and the leaves were perfectly still. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling, just silence, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I glanced down the trail where my parents had gone, feeling a strange sense of loneliness creep in. It was ridiculous. I'd chosen to stay behind. But now, with them gone, I felt like I was the last person on Earth. Suddenly, I heard something, a faint rustling, like footsteps through leaves. My heart started pounding, and I whipped around, looking into the shadows between the trees. Nothing, just more branches and leaves, stretching on forever. I shook my head, forcing myself to look away. "It's nothing," I whispered, "just animals or something." But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A tall, thin figure slipping between the trees, its shape blending with the shadows. My heart froze as I turned to look directly at it, and my breath caught in my throat. It was the same figure from my nightmare, emaciated, hairless, with long, twisted limbs and a face so sunken it looked like a skull. Its eyes glowed faintly, hollow and hungry, fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. The creature's lips were chewed down, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to shine even in the dim light. Its mouth opened slowly, and I could see bits of raw flesh clinging to its teeth. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything, but my legs felt frozen, locked in place. I was alone, isolated. Exactly the type of prey the Windigo hunted. "Carl," it whispered my name, low and guttural, the sound crawling into my ears and wrapping around my mind. It took a step forward, its bones creaking, its claws scraping against the bark of a nearby tree. My stomach twisted, and I finally found my voice. I screamed, stumbling back as I turned and bolted toward the RV, slamming the door behind me. I could still hear the creature's footsteps, soft but relentless, pacing just outside. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't know how long I sat there, frozen, too terrified to even breathe. But after a while, the footsteps faded, the silence returning, thick and suffocating. Slowly, I crept toward the window, peeking out through the blinds. The forest looked empty, still. But that didn't mean it was gone. It was waiting, watching. When my parents finally returned, they were laughing, completely oblivious to what had just happened. My mom shot me a worried look as she climbed back inside the RV. "You okay, Carl? You look pale," she said, reaching up to touch my forehead. Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, pulling away, my mind racing. There was no way they'd believe me if I told them what I saw. They'd think I'd let their stories get into my head, that I'd scared myself with nothing but shadows. But I knew what I'd seen. That creature, the Wendigo, was real, and it was after me. The more I isolated myself, the closer it got, feeding off my loneliness, and I didn't know how to stop it. Dinner that night was tense, at least for me. My parents laughed and joked like nothing was wrong, but I could barely eat. My mind kept flashing back to that face, those hollow, glowing eyes, and the way it had whispered my name, like it knew me. Like it was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When it was time for bed, I climbed into my bunk, my heart pounding as I lay there, listening. The RV was silent, my parents breathing soft and steady from their bunks. I tried to keep my eyes closed, to block out everything that had happened. But every time I drifted close to sleep, I'd hear that voice, low and raspy, calling my name. And then I heard it, the scratching, slow, deliberate, dragging across the side of the RV. My breath hitched, my eyes wide open now, staring at the ceiling, frozen. Carl. The voice was faint, almost like it was coming from within my own mind, but I knew it was outside. I could feel it, that hunger, that emptiness, pressing against the walls of the RV, desperate to get in. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away, that it would disappear into the shadows. But the scratching continued, relentless. It dragged along the length of the RV, stopping just outside my window. When I finally dared to open my eyes, I turned slowly, looking toward the window. All I saw was darkness, no face, no glowing eyes, just shadows. But I knew it was there, waiting. The night passed slowly, the scratching eventually fading away, but the fear didn't. Even after the sound stopped, I lay awake, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the Wendigo was getting closer, growing stronger. By morning, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew it wasn't going to stop. Not until it had what it came for. The plan for the day was another hike. My parents had it all mapped out, and I could see the enthusiasm in their faces, the excitement for another adventure. But all I felt was dread. I'd spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by shadows and whispers, each sound outside the RV setting my nerves on edge. I couldn't get that creature's hollow eyes and terrible smile out of my head. "We're going up to the ridge today," my dad announced over breakfast, pointing to a spot on the map. "Supposed to be a great view of the forest from up there." "Sounds fun," I said, forcing myself to sound upbeat. But the truth was, the thought of venturing deeper into the woods made my skin crawl. Every inch of me wanted to stay put, to avoid going anywhere near the trees, but there was no way I was staying behind alone. Not today. The hike was slow, the narrow trail winding upward through the thick forest. My parents chatted ahead of me, their voices bouncing off the trees, oblivious to the eerie quiet that surrounded us. I trailed behind, my eyes darting between the shadows. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the forest was pressing down on me. As we climbed, I felt it again, that sense of being watched, the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I stopped, glancing over my shoulder, my breath catching as a shadow moved through the trees. "Carl, keep up," my mom called, her voice echoing back down the trail. I hurried to catch up, but my eyes kept flicking toward the trees, searching for whatever had been following us. I didn't see anything, but I knew it was there. I could feel it. When we reached the ridge, my parents marveled at the view, pointing out landmarks in the distance, but I barely glanced at the horizon. The only thing I could focus on was the forest below, the endless stretch of trees, dark and menacing. Somewhere in that sea of green, I knew it was waiting. "Mom, Dad, I don't feel well," I said finally, my voice shaky. "Maybe we should head back." They exchanged a look, my dad frowning. "We just got up here, Carl. Take a minute and try to enjoy it." But I couldn't. I kept glancing around, expecting to see those hollow eyes watching me from the shadows. I was on edge, every nerve screaming that we weren't alone. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the trees behind us, and my stomach twisted. My mom heard it too, and she turned, frowning. "What was that?" she asked, looking into the trees. I wanted to tell her to leave it, to forget about it, but before I could say anything, my dad stepped toward the noise. "Probably an animal," he said, his voice casual. "Might even be a deer." He took a few steps closer, and I felt a surge of panic. "Dad, don't." But it was too late. My dad peered into the trees, his expression curious, oblivious to the danger lurking just beyond his sight. And then it appeared. The Wendigo stepped out from the shadows, its skeletal frame towering and hunched, hollow eyes glowing faintly as it fixed its gaze on my dad. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, gray and hairless, its mouth twisted into a horrible grin, sharp fangs glinting as it bared its teeth. My dad froze, his face going pale as he took a step back, his eyes wide with terror. My mom gasped, grabbing his arm, but she didn't look away from the creature, too shocked to move. I wanted to run, but I was frozen in place, my heart pounding as I watched it move closer, its twisted, emaciated form cutting through the trees. It was massive, its limbs long and bony, each step slow and deliberate, savoring the fear in our eyes. "Carl," it whispered, and the sound was like nails dragging across metal, grating and hollow. My blood turned to ice. My mom grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. "Carl, we need to go. Now." But the Wendigo's eyes were on me, its hunger palpable, pulling me in. Its hand reached out, clawed fingers stretching toward me, and I felt a cold, suffocating weight settle over me, rooting me to the ground. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, my mind clouded by a terrible, gnawing fear. "Carl," my dad yelled, breaking me out of the trance. He grabbed my shoulder, shaking me, and the spell was broken. I stumbled back, my legs finally moving, and we turned and bolted down the trail, my parents' hands gripping my arms as we ran. The Wendigo's footsteps followed, heavy and slow, each one echoing through the trees. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see, but I could feel it behind us, closing in, its presence pressing against my mind, filling my thoughts with its hunger. We ran, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, our footsteps pounding against the trail as we twisted and turned, ducking beneath branches and leaping over roots. I could still hear it behind us, moving through the trees, relentless and patient, as if it knew we couldn't escape. Finally, the RV came into view, and we scrambled inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My parents leaned against the walls, breathing hard, their faces pale and wide-eyed. What was that?" my mom whispered, her voice shaky. I didn't answer, my mind still reeling, my heart pounding as I stared out the window. Outside, the forest was still, silent, but I knew it was out there, watching. My dad placed a trembling hand on my shoulder, his eyes full of fear and something else, understanding. "Carl," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You weren't imagining things, were you?" I shook my head, unable to speak, the memory of those hollow eyes still fresh in my mind. The Wendigo was real, and it was after me, and now, finally, they believed me. The night was long and restless. We kept every light on, huddling together in the RV as the darkness pressed in around us. I could feel the Wendigo's presence outside, waiting, its hunger clawing at the edges of my mind. It was like a black hole, pulling me in, its voice whispering in my thoughts, filling my dreams with shadows and cold. At one point, I heard it again, the scratching. Soft, deliberate, like it was toying with us, reminding us that it was still there. My dad wrapped his arm around me, holding me close, his grip tight and protective. For the first time, I felt a sense of safety, a barrier between me and the creature outside. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. The Wendigo was patient, relentless, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. As the hours dragged on, I lay there, my eyes wide open, my mind racing. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let it keep haunting us, couldn't let it keep feeding on our fear. Somehow, I had to confront it. I had to find a way to face it. The morning brought little comfort. The forest was silent, as if every creature within it had gone into hiding. My parents and I were shaken, exhausted, and I could tell by the way they kept glancing toward the trees that they were as scared as I was. For once, they didn't push me to talk, didn't try to brush off my fears. They knew, just as I did, that something was out there. Maybe we should pack up and leave," my mom said, her voice barely more than a whisper. My dad shook his head, though his hand was trembling as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "This is a national park. We'd have to drive hours to get anywhere with a motel or service, and if we're being followed..." He didn't have to finish. We all knew that whatever was out there would keep following us. It had tasted our fear, fed on it. No place was safe now. "We should tell someone, a ranger or something," I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew how ridiculous it sounded. Maybe they'd believe us. My mom gave a sad smile, one that told me she was just as lost as I was. "Carl, they wouldn't believe a word of it. People think the Wendigo is just a myth, something out of old stories. They'd laugh at us." I swallowed, glancing toward the trees, feeling that familiar, cold gaze settle over me. It was out there, I knew it, watching and waiting. My thoughts were tangled, my heart pounding, and yet deep inside, something shifted. I realized I couldn't keep hiding from it. "What if we confronted it?" I asked, my voice stronger than I felt. "What if I confronted it?" My parents turned to me, their faces a mix of shock and horror. My mom reached for me, gripping my hand. "Carl, no. This thing, it's beyond any of us. You can't face it." "Maybe I don't have a choice." I pulled my hand away gently, feeling a strange, steely resolve settle over me. It's not going to stop, and if it's hunting me, maybe I'm the only one who can end it. For a moment, silence filled the RV. My parents looked at me, their fear clashing with understanding. Finally, my dad sighed, and I saw a glimmer of something I'd never seen in him before. Respect. If you're going to do this, he said slowly, then we're going to help you. The next few hours were spent in tense preparation. My mom packed a small bag with things she said might be protective: herbs, sage, a small amulet she'd once told me was blessed by our tribe's medicine man. My dad drew a circle around the campsite using ashes from the fire, muttering an old chant under his breath. I didn't know if any of it would work, but their belief in it gave me strength. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the trees, I felt that cold presence grow stronger, pressing in from all sides. My stomach twisted, my skin prickling with dread, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't afford to let fear control me now. We stood together in the clearing, my parents on either side of me, and waited. The forest grew darker, the silence thickening until it felt like the world had been wrapped in cotton. Every sound, every rustling leaf, every snap of a branch felt magnified, echoing in the stillness. My parents held my hands tightly, their grips firm and reassuring. But I could feel the tension in their fingers, the tremble of their fear. And then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. It was a sound that didn't belong to any animal I knew, a noise that seemed to vibrate through the ground, rattling in my chest. My mom clutched my hand tighter, her breath coming in short, shaky gasps. "It's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The Wendigo stepped out from the shadows, its skeletal frame hunched, hollow eyes fixed on me. It moved slowly, deliberately, savoring each step, as if it knew we were trapped. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, gray and hairless, its mouth twisted into that horrible, hungry grin. I could see the jagged teeth, the bits of flesh caught between them, its lips chewed down to bloody shreds. It stopped at the edge of the circle, its eyes flicking to the ashes on the ground, almost amused. The Wendigo tilted its head, and I felt its gaze bore into me, filling my mind with a gnawing, insatiable hunger. "Carl," it whispered, the voice rough and broken, like the sound of wind through dead trees. So, alone, I swallowed, forcing myself to stand taller to meet its gaze. "I'm not alone," I said, my voice trembling but steady, "and you don't scare me." The Wendigo's smile widened, revealing more of those jagged, blood-stained teeth. It took a step forward, crossing over the line of ashes with ease, as if the circle meant nothing. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, freezing my thoughts, numbing my limbs. My dad squeezed my shoulder, whispering into my ear, "Remember, Carl, it's fear that gives it power. Don't let it feed on your fear." I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and stared into the Wendigo's hollow eyes. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, the words feeling like a lifeline, grounding me. The Wendigo hissed, its face contorting with rage. "You will be," it growled, stepping closer. I could feel its breath, cold and rotten, brushing against my skin. But I didn't back down. I felt a strange warmth spread through me, something I couldn't explain, a strength I hadn't known was there. I reached for the amulet my mom had given me, gripping it tightly, and felt a surge of energy, like a barrier pushing the creature back. The Wendigo snarled, its eyes narrowing, and it lashed out, its claws swiping at me. I stumbled, but my dad caught me, steadying me as I held the amulet up like a shield. The creature's claws stopped inches from my face, and I saw a flicker of something in its eyes. Fear. "Go back," I said, my voice stronger now, filled with a power I hadn't felt before. "You don't belong here." The Wendigo let out a shriek, a sound of pure rage and desperation. It took a step back, its body twisting and contorting as if it were fighting against an invisible force. I watched, my heart pounding, as it stumbled, retreating into the shadows. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, its eyes burning with fury. "This isn't over," it whispered, its voice a promise, a curse, and then it was gone, melting into the darkness, leaving only silence in its wake. I stood there, the night air heavy around me, my heart racing. My parents pulled me into a tight hug, their relief almost palpable. But I knew, even as we celebrated, that this wasn't over. The Wendigo might have retreated, but it was still out there, waiting. And until I understood why it was hunting me, until I found a way to break its hold, I knew it would keep coming back. But for the first time, I felt hope. I had faced it, stood my ground, and I knew that somehow I would find a way to defeat it. After the confrontation with the Wendigo, my parents didn't question me when I suggested we stop at the nearby reservation. They knew we needed help, and I could see in their eyes that they were just as desperate as I was to find some way to put an end to this nightmare. The reservation was small, quiet, a world away from the forest that had become a dark cage. As we drove in, I felt an odd sense of calm settle over me, like the weight I'd been carrying had been lifted, if only for a moment. My mom asked a few people where we might find a medicine man, and we were eventually directed to a small cabin at the edge of the community. The man who answered the door was older, with long gray hair braided down his back and a face weathered by years of wisdom and experience. His eyes met mine, and in that instant, I felt something shift inside me, a sense that he knew, somehow, what had been following me. Without a word, he gestured for us to come inside. The cabin was filled with the smell of burning herbs, the smoke curling in lazy tendrils around the ceiling. Charms and feathers hung from the walls, and a collection of stones lay carefully arranged on a small table. The medicine man sat across from me, his gaze piercing, almost as if he could see right through me. "You've seen it," he said, his voice soft but full of power. It wasn't a question. I nodded, swallowing hard, feeling my hands begin to shake as the memories surfaced again. The Windigo, it's been following me, and I don't know why. The medicine man nodded slowly, his expression grave. The Windigo is a spirit that preys on loneliness, isolation. It feeds on those who are disconnected from their people, their family, their heritage. It has sensed your separation and has chosen you as its prey. I glanced at my parents, feeling a strange mix of guilt and fear. Had I brought this on myself? Had my distance, my refusal to connect, made me vulnerable? The medicine man watched me, his eyes filled with a wisdom I couldn't quite grasp. The Windigo is drawn to those who have turned away from their roots, from their community. It is a spirit of hunger, consuming those who feel empty inside. I looked down, feeling the weight of his words. The isolation I'd felt, my resentment toward the traditions my parents wanted me to embrace. It was as if the Windigo had sensed those things, that it had latched on to my own loneliness. "But how do I make it stop?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "How do I make it go away?" The medicine man studied me for a long moment, and then he rose, moving to a small chest in the corner of the room. He pulled out a bundle of herbs, a feather, and a small leather pouch. Setting them on the table, he looked at me with a steady, unblinking gaze. "You must reconnect, Carl. You must face this spirit, not with fear, but with strength that comes from knowing who you are and where you come from. The Windigo feeds on emptiness. Fill that emptiness with the strength of your people, your family, and it will have no power over you." He handed me the pouch, his fingers wrapping around mine. "This amulet has been blessed, passed down through generations. It will protect you, but only if you believe in its power and the strength of those who came before you." I nodded, my fingers tightening around the pouch. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I felt a flicker of hope, small, but enough to hold on to. The medicine man instructed us on a ritual that could help break the Windigo's hold. It would require the herbs, the amulet, and the strength of my parents and me, united together. But he warned me that this wasn't just a matter of chanting words or burning sage. I had to truly feel the connection to my family, to my ancestors, to everything I had been so quick to dismiss. "You will need to face it again," he said, his voice firm. "The Windigo will not leave until it knows it has no claim over you. But remember, Carl, it cannot harm you if you are whole. It can only take what is empty." His words lingered in my mind as we left the cabin and returned to the RV. My parents were quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I could feel their support, their love, even if we didn't speak it aloud. It was like a warmth in the pit of my stomach, steady and comforting. That night, as we set up camp again, I could feel the Windigo's presence creeping back in, like a chill in the air that seeped through my skin, right down to my bones. But this time, I wasn't alone. My parents gathered around me, and together we lit the herbs, allowing the smoke to curl around us, creating a circle of protection. We began the ritual, each of us reciting the words the medicine man had taught us. I held the amulet tightly, feeling its weight in my hand, grounding me. The night was dark, the stars hidden behind thick clouds, and the forest was eerily silent. And then, just as I'd expected, I heard it. The scratching, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. The Windigo was coming. I forced myself to stand tall, to keep my voice steady as I chanted. I could feel the Windigo's hunger pressing in, a gnawing emptiness that tried to claw its way into my mind, filling me with visions of isolation, of being utterly alone. But I held firm, feeling my parents' hands on my shoulders, their strength feeding into me, their love filling the emptiness I'd carried for so long. The scratching grew louder, and I saw the Windigo's outline at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing, fixed on me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. It stepped forward, crossing the boundary of our circle, and for a moment I felt the familiar pang of fear. But I gripped the amulet tighter, my voice rising as I chanted louder, feeling the warmth of my family beside me. The Windigo took another step, its bony hand reaching out, its jagged teeth bared in a snarl. "You have no power here," I whispered, my voice trembling but strong. The Windigo let out a furious shriek, its form flickering, the shadows around it twisting as it tried to push through. I could feel it struggling, its claws reaching for me, but the ritual held, a barrier between us, powered by something deeper than I'd ever understood. And then, as if it had been burned, the Wendigo stumbled back, its eyes narrowing with a hatred that chilled me to my core. It melted into the shadows, its form dissolving, retreating back into the depths of the forest. The silence returned, the air still and heavy, and I realized I was shaking, my heart pounding. My parents pulled me into a tight embrace, and I felt a surge of relief, a weight lifting from my chest. The Wendigo was gone, for now. But I knew it would be back, until I fully embraced who I was, until I found a way to fill. The relief from our last encounter with the Windigo was short-lived. That night, as I lay in bed, the fear started creeping back. The medicine man had helped me understand why the Windigo was hunting me, but I knew that simply understanding wasn't enough to make it stop. The emptiness was still there, the loneliness I'd tried to ignore, and the Windigo knew it. After hours of restless turning, I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, only to be thrust into another nightmare. I was back in the forest, alone, the air thick and suffocating. The trees around me seemed to bend and twist, looming over me like dark figures. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, and I could hear something moving just beyond the reach of the moonlight. The Wendigo's presence was stronger than ever, its hollow eyes and emaciated body lurking in the darkness. But this time, I didn't try to run. I felt a pull, an almost magnetic draw toward the creature. I took a step forward, and then another, feeling the shadows close in around me, thick and cloying. It was like the forest itself was trapping me, guiding me into the creature's grasp. "Carl," the Wendigo's voice whispered, low and taunting, like a song meant to lull me deeper into the darkness. "Come, alone." I felt my body moving, as if I had no control, my legs carrying me deeper into the trees. The shadows grew thicker, wrapping around me, pressing in on all sides until I couldn't breathe. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth opened, but the darkness swallowed everything, and I felt a cold, sharp pain, a hunger, clawing its way into me, gnawing at my insides. And then I woke up, gasping, sweat-soaked, and trembling. But something was wrong. I was lying on the ground, damp leaves and sticks poking into my back, the air around me heavy with the scent of earth and moss. My heart pounded as I sat up, looking around. I was in the forest, miles away from the RV. I didn't remember leaving, didn't know how I'd ended up here. The moon cast a dim light over the clearing, and the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, curling and twisting around me like tendrils. Panic surged through me as I realized I was alone, truly alone. My parents had no idea where I was. I had no way to find them. "Mom, Dad," I shouted, my voice swallowed by the trees. The silence that followed was thick and unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. A soft, rustling sound came from the trees, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My heart raced as I turned, squinting into the shadows, trying to make out the shape lurking just beyond the edge of the clearing. And then, slowly, it stepped into the light. The Wendigo was more terrifying than ever, its skeletal frame towering and hunched, hollow eyes fixed on me with a look of pure, insatiable hunger. Its skin was stretched so tight over its bones that it looked ready to tear, and its lips were chewed down to bloody shreds, revealing sharp, jagged teeth beneath. Its bony fingers ended in claws that glinted in the moonlight, and as it stared at me, its mouth twisted into a sickening grin. I tried to stand, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen, the fear paralyzing me. The Wendigo took a step forward, its eyes locked on me, its hand reaching out, and I felt that familiar, suffocating pressure in my chest, like it was pulling the life out of me, piece by piece. "Carl," it whispered, drawing out my name, savoring it, feeding on my terror. "You cannot escape." Desperation clawed at me, and I forced myself to remember the medicine man's words. I had to fill the emptiness, to connect to my family, my heritage. I closed my eyes, focusing on my parents, on the love they had for me, on the strength of our bond. I imagined their faces, their voices, their warmth. Slowly, I felt a flicker of something, a warmth pushing back against the Wendigo's pull. When I opened my eyes, the creature was closer, its hand inches from my face. But I could feel the warmth growing, a light inside me, holding the Wendigo at bay. "You don't control me," I whispered, my voice shaking but steady. "I'm not alone." The Wendigo recoiled, its eyes narrowing, a look of fury contorting its face. It let out a furious hiss, its claws scraping against the ground as it stumbled back. I took a shaky breath, feeling the warmth spread through me, stronger now, pushing the creature further back. For a moment, I thought I had won. But the Wendigo's face twisted into a snarl, its eyes burning with a rage that chilled me to the bone. It lunged forward, faster than I could react, and its hand wrapped around my wrist, its grip icy and crushing. Pain shot through me, and I felt my strength draining, the warmth flickering as the Wendigo's hunger gnawed at me, its empty eyes boring into mine. "You are alone," it growled, its voice dripping with malice. "No one can save you." I felt the light inside me flicker, weakening, and panic surged. I was losing. I was going to die out here, alone in the forest, consumed by this creature. But then, faintly, I heard something, a voice calling my name. "Carl!" My heart leapt as I recognized my dad's voice. I turned, and through the trees I saw a faint light, a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Relief flooded through me, and I felt the warmth inside me surge, stronger than before. The Wendigo hissed, its grip loosening, and I wrenched my arm free, stumbling backward toward the light. The creature's face contorted with fury as it watched me retreat, but I could see the fear in its eyes now, the way it recoiled from the light, from the warmth that filled me. "Carl!" My mom's voice joined my dad's, and I turned, running toward them, the forest blurring around me as I crashed through the trees. I could hear the Wendigo's footsteps behind me, relentless, its growls filling the air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. And then, finally, I broke through the trees, stumbling into the clearing where my parents stood, their faces pale and frightened, but full of relief as they saw me. "Mom! Dad!" I gasped, collapsing into their arms, feeling their warmth surround me, filling the emptiness, pushing back the fear. The Wendigo stood at the edge of the clearing, its hollow eyes watching us with a mixture of fury and hunger, its body trembling with rage. But it didn't cross the line. I could see it, the way it clawed at the ground, desperate, but unable to come any closer. "We're here, Carl," my dad whispered, holding me close, his voice steady and strong. "We're with you. You're not alone." The Wendigo let out a shriek, its body flickering, its form blurring as it stumbled back, melting into the shadows. I watched it go, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness, as if a part of me had been left behind in the darkness. But I knew that this wasn't the end. The Wendigo would come back. It would keep coming until I found a way to break its hold over me completely. But I also knew that I had the strength to face it. With my family by my side, with the warmth of their love filling the emptiness, I knew that somehow I would find a way to defeat it once and for all. The next day dawned cold and gray, the sky shrouded in a thick layer of clouds that cast everything in an eerie, muted light. My parents and I stayed close to the RV, tense and quiet, each of us trying to process what had happened. The Wendigo's presence still lingered at the edges of my mind, like a dark shadow waiting to slip in. But there was something different now, a sense of determination that burned inside me, stronger than the fear. I was done running, done hiding. I had seen what the Wendigo could do, felt its power, but I'd also felt the power of my family, the strength that had come from our connection. I knew, deep down, that this was the key to defeating it. "We need to finish the ritual," I told my parents over breakfast, my voice steady. "The one the medicine man taught us. It's the only way." My dad nodded, his expression serious. "We're with you, Carl, whatever it takes." We spent the day gathering the things we would need: herbs, ashes, stones, and the amulet the medicine man had given me. My mom carefully arranged everything in the clearing, creating a circle that would serve as our line of defense. I could see the worry in her eyes, but also a quiet strength. She believed in me, and that belief gave me courage. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, we gathered in the circle. The air was cold, the silence heavy, and I could feel the Wendigo's presence creeping in, drawn to the power of the ritual, to the bond between us. I gripped the amulet tightly, feeling its rough surface press into my palm, grounding me. My dad lit the herbs, and the smoke curled up into the air, thick and fragrant, forming a protective barrier around us. My mom began to chant softly, her voice steady and rhythmic, filling the silence with a strength I hadn't realized she had. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of her voice wash over me, feeling the warmth of my parents on either side of me. I joined in the chant, my voice blending with theirs, creating a harmony that felt ancient, timeless. The words filled me with a sense of unity, of connection, not just to my parents, but to something much larger, a lineage, a history that I had been so quick to dismiss. The Wendigo's presence grew stronger, pressing against the edge of the circle, trying to break through. I could hear it whispering my name, taunting me, feeding me images of isolation, of a life without my family, without connection. But I pushed the visions away, focusing on the warmth, the light that filled me, grounding myself in the bond we shared. And then, slowly, the Wendigo appeared at the edge of the clearing, its skeletal frame hunched, its hollow eyes fixed on me. It looked even more twisted than before, its skin stretched tight over bones, its lips chewed down to bloody shreds. Its mouth opened in a terrible grin, revealing rows of jagged, hungry teeth. It whispered, the word drawn out dripping with malice. "You cannot hide." But I wasn't hiding. Not anymore. "You have no power here," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I'm not alone." The Wendigo let out a furious hiss, its form flickering, its claws reaching out, scraping against the invisible barrier of our circle. The smoke from the herbs thickened, swirling around us, pushing the creature back, but it fought against it, its hollow eyes burning with a rage that chilled me to the bone. My parents tightened their grips on my shoulders, their voices rising with mine as we chanted louder, stronger. The Wendigo let out a furious shriek, its body twisting, contorting as it tried to push through the barrier. But I could feel it weakening, its strength faltering against the power of our unity. I took a step forward, holding the amulet up like a shield, feeling its energy surge through me, filling me with a strength I hadn't known I had. The Wendigo recoiled, its eyes narrowing as it snarled, its claws slashing through the air, but it couldn't reach me. I could feel the warmth inside me growing, pushing back the darkness, filling the emptiness that the Wendigo had tried so hard to exploit. "You don't belong here," I said, my voice ringing out clear and strong. "Go back to the shadows. You have no hold over me." The Wendigo let out one last desperate shriek, its body flickering, the shadows twisting around it as it tried to hold on, to keep its grip on me. But the power of the ritual, the strength of our bond, was too much. I could see the fear in its eyes now, the way it recoiled from the light, from the warmth that filled me. With one final, agonized scream, the Wendigo's form began to dissolve, its body unraveling into the shadows, melting back into the darkness. I watched, breathless, as it disappeared, its hollow eyes fixed on me until the very end, filled with a hatred that burned like ice. And then it was gone. The silence that followed was deep and profound, the air heavy with the scent of herbs and smoke. I felt my parents' arms around me, their warmth and strength steady and unwavering. I had done it. We had done it. For the first time, I felt whole. The emptiness that the Wendigo had fed on was gone, replaced by a strength that came from knowing I was part of something larger, something unbreakable. We stood there in the clearing, the silence settling over us like a blanket. My parents' arms were wrapped around me, their love and warmth filling the space where fear had once been. I knew that the Wendigo was gone, that it could no longer harm me. But more than that, I knew that I was no longer alone. I had found my connection, not only to my family, but to my heritage, to a strength that ran deeper than I had ever understood. As we made our way back to the RV, the forest seemed different, calmer, as if a weight had been lifted from it as well. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet confidence that I would carry with me from that moment forward. The Wendigo had been defeated, its power broken, and for the first time, I felt like I truly knew who I was. I was more than just a kid on a family road trip. I was part of a legacy, part of a story that had been passed down through generations. And I knew, with a certainty that filled me with strength, that I would carry that story forward. The Wendigo might have vanished from sight, but its presence lingered, a shadow hanging over the forest, and, somewhere deep inside me, a quiet reminder that this battle wasn't over. Even with my parents beside me, I knew the Wendigo wasn't truly gone. It was waiting, watching for any weakness, ready to strike if I gave it the chance. "We need to go back to the medicine man," I said, my voice quiet but certain. My parents nodded, their faces grim and determined. They knew, just as I did, that this wasn't finished. The drive to the reservation was tense. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that flickered across the road made me jump. I could feel the Wendigo's pull, its hunger gnawing at me. But I also felt the strength of my parents, their belief in me bolstering my courage. When we arrived at the medicine man's cabin, he was waiting for us, as if he'd known we were coming. His expression was serious, his gaze intense as he looked at me. "You faced it, didn't you?" he asked, and I nodded, feeling the weight of the encounter settle over me. "But it's not gone," I said, the words barely more than a whisper. "I can still feel it." The medicine man nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a sadness that made my stomach twist. "The Wendigo is a spirit of hunger and loneliness, Carl. It feeds on those who feel lost, disconnected. You have faced it, but it will not truly leave until you break its hold completely. This is your final test." My parents exchanged worried glances, but I felt a strange calm settle over me. I knew what I had to do. "Tell me what I need to do," I said, my voice steady. The medicine man led us back into his cabin, where he explained the ritual that would break the Wendigo's hold once and for all. It was a cleansing ceremony, one that would strip away the darkness the Wendigo had left in me, filling that space with the strength of my ancestors, my heritage, and the love of my family. He handed me a feather, a small bowl filled with herbs, and a ceremonial knife. "These will help you face the Wendigo in its truest form, to confront the shadow it has left within you." That night, we prepared for the final ritual. The medicine man instructed us to return to the forest, to the clearing where the Wendigo had first shown itself. My parents and I gathered in a circle, the smoke from the herbs curling around us, forming a protective barrier. The forest was silent, watching, as if it too knew what was coming. I knelt in the center of the circle, the feather and bowl of herbs in front of me, the ceremonial knife resting across my knees. The medicine man stood beside me, chanting softly, his voice steady and powerful, anchoring me to the earth, to my family, to my ancestors. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in, thicker than before. I could feel the Wendigo's presence, the weight of its hunger, its rage. But I didn't let it fill me with fear. Instead, I let the warmth of my parents' presence wash over me, grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. The medicine man's chant grew louder, filling the clearing, and I began to chant along with him, my voice merging with his, creating a wall of sound that pushed back against the shadows. And then the Wendigo appeared. It was more terrifying than ever, its body twisted and broken, hollow eyes burning with hatred and hunger. It stood at the edge of the circle, its claws reaching out, scraping against the invisible barrier. I could feel its anger, its desperation. It knew this was the end. "You have no power here," I said, my voice steady, strong. "You feed on emptiness, but I am filled with the strength of my family, my ancestors. You cannot touch me." The Wendigo let out a furious shriek, its form flickering as it clawed at the barrier, trying to break through. I could feel its pull, its hunger, trying to find any weakness in me. But I didn't back down. With one final breath, I took the ceremonial knife, cutting a small line across my palm, letting the blood drip onto the herbs. The medicine man nodded, his eyes filled with approval, and I knew I had taken the final step. I held my hand up, letting the blood-stained herbs fall to the ground, completing the ritual. The Windigo screamed, its form unraveling, the shadows twisting and contorting as it was pulled back into the darkness. For a moment, I saw its eyes, filled with a desperate, pleading look, as if it were begging for release. And then, with a final agonized shriek, it vanished, dissolving into the shadows. The silence that followed was profound, a deep, comforting stillness that filled the clearing. I felt my parents' arms around me, their warmth grounding me, anchoring me to the earth, to the present. The Wendigo was gone. Its hold on me, its hunger, its darkness, had been broken. The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, we stood together in the clearing, feeling the warmth of the sun on our faces. I felt different, lighter, as if a weight I hadn't even known I'd been carrying had finally been lifted. The medicine man placed a hand on my shoulder, his eyes filled with pride. "You have faced your darkness, Carl, and come through stronger. The Wendigo can no longer touch you." I nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over me. I had faced the Wendigo, had faced the emptiness it had tried to fill with fear, and I had defeated it, not with anger or hatred, but with the strength of love, of family, of heritage. As we made our way back to the RV, I felt a quiet confidence, a certainty that I was no longer alone. I was connected, part of something larger, something ancient and unbreakable. The next morning, a sense of peace had settled over me, a quiet confidence I hadn't felt before. The Windigo was gone, its dark influence finally lifted. I could feel it in the way the sun warmed my skin, the way the forest seemed calmer, as if it, too, had been released from a shadow. After completing the cleansing ritual, the medicine man looked at me with a warmth that felt like home. He placed his hand on my shoulder, and his eyes held a quiet pride as he spoke. "Carl, you have walked through shadows and found your strength," he said. "From this day forward, you are Wombliska, White Eagle. You are no longer lost. You carry the strength of our people with you." My heart swelled at his words, and I felt a surge of gratitude, a connection that went beyond words. I'd spent so much of my life avoiding my heritage, brushing off stories I thought didn't matter. But now, those stories, that heritage, was part of me. I could feel it, a thread that connected me to my family, to my ancestors, to everything that had come before me. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. The name Wombliska felt like more than just a title. It was a reminder of everything I'd fought for, a badge of resilience and connection. As we left the reservation, the world felt different. The trees looked brighter, the sky more open. My parents and I didn't need to say much. The strength of our bond spoke louder than any words could. We had faced something dark and ancient together, and we had come out stronger on the other side. During the drive, my mom reached over, giving my hand a squeeze. She didn't need to say anything, but I could feel her pride, her relief, in the way her fingers held mine. "So, Wombliska," she said, a small smile playing at her lips, "how does it feel to be a part of something bigger?" I looked at her, feeling a warmth spread through me. "It feels right," I said, the words feeling as true as anything I'd ever said. "Like I've finally found my place." My dad chuckled from the driver's seat, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "I always knew you had it in you, Carl. You just needed to see it for yourself." The journey home felt like a new beginning. The RV, which had once felt cramped and confining, now felt like a small, safe world where I was surrounded by family, by love, by strength. Every mile brought us closer, not just to our physical home, but to a sense of belonging I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Over the next few weeks, my life settled back into its usual rhythm, but something inside me had changed. I found myself asking questions about our heritage, about our traditions, things I had once shrugged off as unimportant. My parents were thrilled, sharing stories I'd heard before, but never really listened to. I began visiting the medicine man, learning about rituals, stories, and symbols that held meaning for our people. He taught me how to respect the land, how to listen to the wisdom of nature, how to see the world through a different lens. With each lesson, I felt a deeper connection growing, a grounding that brought me closer to my family, my tribe, my ancestors. The Wendigo was gone, but its memory lingered as a reminder that darkness feeds on loneliness, on isolation. But with family, with connection, that darkness had no hold on me. One evening, as the sun was setting, I joined my family around a small campfire in our backyard. My dad started telling a story, one of the old legends, his voice carrying the same reverence I'd heard in the medicine man's cabin. But this time, I wasn't just listening. I was part of it, part of the story, the legacy. And as I sat there, watching the flames flicker, feeling the warmth of my family beside me, I knew that I was no longer just Carl. I was Wambleska, White Eagle, and I was never alone.